Today I'm going to show you a quick tip on getting some nice shading on your Fume Fire here, specifically explosions today. So I'm going to show you what I have set up here in Fume for rendering. So under the fire gradient, just pretty simple. The thing is though, on the key color, the first flag, I have what it looks black in the gradient, but it's actually not. It's a red flag with a value of 4. And on the last flag, I have a just bright orange value with a value of 255. Okay. The smoke is a very dark smoke, like a gasoline fire, a gasoline explosion. So the smoke color is just 10. And lastly, on illumination under the multiple scattering, I have the fire strength at 10,000, and that sounds really high, but that's what it takes to get it to actually show up in such a dark smoke. And my fall off is 11. Just a quick note, all these values that I'm using are because I also use a linear workflow and I have my gamma and LUT correction on. And I believe Max 2014 and above has this on by default. So it may change slightly what you're used to working with Fume if you have not adopted a linear workflow up until now, but I'm going to assume that you are because that is the correct way to work. So all of my examples will be dependent on a linear workflow. So with that, let's hop over to After Effects and take a look at the second part. So here we are in After Effects, and just to show what I've rendered the explosion fire and the explosion smoke separately. And I want to show how those are set up here. So let's go to Interpret Footage, Main. And the first thing I always do when I bring in a fire pass is I switch alpha to ignore, because a fire's opacity usually doesn't need to be determined by alpha. It can be determined by its brightness. So I usually actually excuse me, I usually add fire passes or screen them, but since I use linear workflow, it's almost always add. And under color management, because remember we were using linear workflow in Max, I've clicked Preserve RGB, and you'll see why here in a second. Hit OK. Now if we go under the smoke and interpret footage, main, you'll see I've left the alpha to pre-multiplied because I want the smoke to determine the opacity of the explosion, and that's how it is in reality. A fiery explosion will be mostly see-through because it'll have very little smoke. Now, a gasoline explosion with lots of smoke will have a fireball as well, but it'll be very dense because the soot particles underneath will not allow it to be translucent or transparent. So that's why I do it that way. So under color management, I've also hit Preserve RGB. And for maximum flexibility when in After Effects, I actually like to work in 32-bit float. And I have rendered these passes using V-Ray with 32-bit EXRs. Now, the thing I wanted to mention about scanline is you don't want to render these passes to scanline, because scanline will cap your footage at 16 bits. And you want a 32-bit, especially for the fire. The smoke you can probably get away with 16, but the fire, for what we're going to use it, you really need a 32-bit float image EXR. So use Mental Ray or use V-Ray to render your Fume elements. So I'm going to go to the project settings here. I'm going to switch my depth to 32 bits float, working space sRGB, and make sure to linearize your workspace so that we are still working in linear space. So hit OK. Now let's drag these two elements into a new comp. Okay. And let's see, the smoke is on top, we want that on bottom. So let's look at our fire pass here just for a second alone. If I go the same frame we saw in Max, so that's the render using that gradient I showed you in Max and the multi-scatter settings. You know, that looks pretty good. You can definitely see this as a base that we can start from, make a good image out of. But the problem is the colors aren't very realistic. So we need to do something about that. Now, one of the first things I also do is I don't render motion blur out of Max. I like to use Real Smart. So I'm actually going to make a, instead of doing Real Smart on that layer, I'm going to do an adjustment layer. We'll call this motion blur. I'm going to drag Real Smart onto it and just leave the default settings. and now we have some nice motion blur for our plume. Now, to affect the fire here, we need to think about what we want to do, and if you look at a real fire, you know, Fume renders have a tendency to want the brightest parts to just kind of stay this muddy yellow. And I've seen that lots of times, and you know, when I was first starting out, I had that problem too, and that yellow just does not look realistic. When a fire blows out through a camera, it actually usually goes to white. But Fume just doesn't want to do that. So we need to kind of make it do it with some compositing tricks. So the best way I found in After Effects is actually to use Video Copilot's color vibrance effect. So I'm going to drag that on, and the first thing you'll notice is it goes this yucky kind of green, but that's because the default is green. Oh, excuse me, I dragged that on the adjustment layer. Let's put it on the actual fire layer. There we go. Okay, so now let's turn this kind of pukey green. Now keep in mind we're also in a linear workspace, and VC color vibrance is kind of made to not work that way. So let's go to the gamma and add 2.2 correction to it just to make it work properly linear. So there we go. Now this color is awful ugly, but we're going to make this look a little bit more fiery. So let's go to the color. Let's take the red, put it at 1. And the green at 0.75. Now this will immediately give us some really nice explosion colors. Look at that. See there? So now we've got this rich red, you know, in the dark. So we've got this nice yellow in the midtones, and we've got that nice bright white blowout in the brightest areas. So that already looks way better. So let's turn this off just to see the difference. You see? Much, much better. Now, that gets us most of the way there. But another thing is fire needs to glow. And you can use After Effects standard glow, but I found it doesn't really look physically correct as far as the way it falls off. So a buddy of mine actually helped me write a plugin called Real Glow, and you can get it. I'll have a link below. If you apply that to the Fume, at first it'll be too bright, clearly, but you can already see how the glow falls off nice and realistically instead of that nasty linear kind of blur that After Effects does. But this is already too bright, so let's just turn this down, the intensity to 0.025. Okay, so now that gives us a really nice glow, subtle. Of course, if we go back to the beginning where it's really bright, you'll see a brighter glow. See? Now the only thing I should mention here is you'll notice that the glow is a bit oh, I'm sorry, Real Glow is supposed to be on the fire layer. Put it on the adjustment layer again. So let me copy that, delete, put it on the fire. Okay. So one thing color vibrance does do, and I don't know why or how to prevent it, is it's adding some blue into this white. So if you look at the info palette here, look how much blue is brighter than every other color. So I don't know why it's doing that, but just to stop that from happening, just do a spill suppressor before the glow, and that'll take out the blue problem. So there you go. And let's go look at the flame again here. That's looking really nice. So now we can turn our smoke back on and add the fire back on top. Go a few more frames in. And now we've got this really nice fire coloring thanks to the Video Copilot Color Vibrance plugin. And now I will go ahead and show you the final result.